New Zealand. And
thanks for the invite. I have been finding myself talking in places of which I have no real background. So talking to the International Society for Computational Biology is another one of those places. But I think it's really just reflects the fact that there's sort of intersections where the kinds of work which you're doing are intersecting with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities in a variety of ways, and trying to ensure that the sorts of ideas and the sorts of values which they want to express can work through that space as well. So I guess that's why the title of this talk is generally around recognizing Indigenous rights and digital sequence information. And in some ways it follows on from the previous, I'm not sure if it was the immediately previous talk in this series from Professor Stephanie Carroll, who's talking about Indigenous data sovereignty. And that plays a big part in the thinking that informs where those rights might sit in relation to digital sequence information. But before I really get into things, I just want to give an acknowledgement to country, acknowledge and celebrating the First Peoples on whose traditional lands we meet, and particularly as we're meeting in these sort of Zoom environments and electronic environments, the First Peoples on the places where we're all coming from. Also acknowledging and celebrating Waikato Tainui, which is the tribe on whose lands I live here in Hamilton in New Zealand, and pay my respects to them. But my own connection is with Whakatohea. So Mākio is the maunga that we affiliate with. Waiawa is the awa. Mātātua is the canoe which my ancestors sailed across the Pacific Ocean from the islands to Aotearoa. And Whakatohea is the name of my tribe, and Maui Hudson is my name. And so in part, I think I was invited to come and speak in this through Crystal Sosi. And I met Crystal as a part of the SING program. And the SING program, if I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, is the Summer Internship for Indigenous Genomics. And it started in the US, and the program there I think has been running almost 10 years. Some work which I was doing around developing guidelines for Māori in relation to genomics and biobanking led me to conferences at that point when we still could travel to each other's countries, and I came across the SING program, and then was able to introduce it to New Zealand as well. So we just held our sixth workshop. It's sort of a 1-week workshop where we're trying to introduce either undergrad, postgrad, or community members to sort of a variety of I guess disciplines that are relevant to genomics. And so that's doing some of the stuff in the wet lab. It's doing having some discussions around ethical issues, what some of the cultural issues as it relates to genomic research are, but also dealing with issues around bioinformatics as well. And just giving people a familiarity with that. So mostly we get the odd person, and all of the attendees are, like all the attendees here are Māori. I think we've had 2 out of the 80 odd that had a sort of a strong background in bioinformatics or computer science. So it's certainly not a space where we're seeing many Māori or Indigenous people gravitating towards, but we recognise that it is actually really important. And if we haven't got our own people sort of operating in that space, then we need to be partnering with people that are. And so then that's important. There's also been branches of SING that have been set up in Canada and Australia. And last year, 2020, I'm not sure if you can see over my back as well, the posters on the wall behind me, but we held the first Indigenous Genomics conference here in Hamilton, and that was really successful. And one of the things we had invited a range of people, scientists have much to contribute to genetic research and are making their voices heard. And so part of, I guess, the background which we're trying to work in here is dealing not only with issues around Indigenous rights, and you'll see those sorts of or similar sorts of issues emerging more broadly when you're thinking about issues around diversity, issues around inclusion, issues around equity, things like Black Lives Matter. All of these sort of social movements that are pushing towards that greater space are happening at the same time as we're having all the sort of technological advances, which are pushing forward other sorts of activities. And those are things like, the Earth Biogenome Project. And I'm putting this up, and actually a couple of other slides, just to set that context that certainly the Indigenous researchers that are operating in this space are acutely aware that there is this drive to sequence everything, literally everything. And so sequencing life, whether it's through the Earth Biogenome Project, whether it's a sort of activities advanced through DNA Zoo, the issues around the Earth Bank of Codes, this whole activity, which is part of what's been seen as sort of a new wave of being able to create value, is emerging. And I think this community, the computational biology one, is really at the center of it, because it's one thing to be able to go out now and sequence all of these different species, all of these different microorganisms, but then you have to make sense of it. And in the process of making sense of it, and then in the process of then turning that into some kind of value, there's all these parts along that pathway where Indigenous communities would like to be a part of. So the work which I've primarily been doing, and this was my transition from physiotherapy into ethics, and then ethics into genetics, came about in part because I started working at a place called Environmental Science and Research. That was a research institute that had a couple of different applications of genetics. So one was they provided forensic science services to the police. And so we were dealing with national DNA databases. And then they were also trying to establish a envirogenomics program. And that was, while it was a little bit more in the health space, it was also around the same time as a number of sort of ethical challenges were arising around sort of wide-scale genomic testing, and as opposed to the things that communities have become comfortable with in terms of genetic testing for specific conditions, but as it started being used more generally for other conditions like diabetes, which people would say have more environmental effects rather than genetic ones, those raised a whole another set of issues for the communities. And then we had the warrior gene incident come about, which also then created another sort of wave of controversy, at least in New Zealand, about how genomics was being used to make not make decisions, but kind of generalize why, give a genetic rationale for the social inequalities that were present in society. And that was where you start to get into kind of really dicey areas. So I was involved with a project called Te Mata Era, which ended up developing these guidelines for genomic research with Māori and guidelines for biobanking with Māori. And just currently involved in a project that's doing the same thing, but with indigenous flora and fauna, or what we refer to here as taonga species. And one of the things in going through this process is we, identified sort of Māori and indigenous Māori concepts, which help them make sense of the context of genomics. And they were ideas which worked really well in the context of samples, but that translation of the samples into data, and the difference between where samples would sit in a physical sense and the degree to which they were shared versus what you can do with data, and then also how data then gets pushed into open spaces. There's sort of a significant difference in what that means in terms of accessibility and control. And so that was something which we realized our ideas worked quite well for the sample space, but they became harder to operationalize when you're thinking about data. And so the importance, though, of both the samples and the data was reflected in what we talked about, but also came through in other work that was been going on at the same time. So just highlighting here the framework that was put together by Katrina Claw and colleagues, and these are colleagues of ours that are associated with the SING network as well. But really talking about a framework for ethical genomic research with Indigenous communities. And the framework on the right-hand side was in part generated from thinking about how do you practically implement the ideas we came up with in the Te Mataira project into genomic research. Kind of a research group. And if you just look in the blue part in the middle where we talk about tissue as a taonga, so that's, the tissue itself is something which needs to be looked after and managed. The DNA that's extracted, that's a taonga, and then the data is a taonga as well. So all of those things require some sort of active management to make sure that they're used in the appropriate way. And you'll see that, all of those things in that research space then lead down into data governance, given that we generate, often the process of research is generating data, but that data then takes on a life of its own as it's pushed out into or shared on open databases and platforms. And so while this, we've had this sort of active conversation happening around what better research practice looks like around genomics there, alongside that, this area of Indigenous data sovereignty was emerging, and that was connected in part. I think Stephanie would have talked a lot about that. Stephanie and I were involved with the development of the care principles for Indigenous data governance. But even though this was operating in a broader context than just genomics, it had an application, a direct application to this space as well. So, really thinking about how data that's being generated contributes to, these principles of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so there's conversations about governance of data, about accessibility to data, are ones that are also happening within the sort of genomics community at large, not necessarily with the same sort of focus. And you'll see here there was this publication in Science that was really a push from a broad group of researchers that were advocating towards unrestricted use of public genomic data. And you'll see here a few of the principles which they were associating that. So, and making the suggestion that publication interests should not limit access to public data, and that this is all consistent with the advocacy that sits around open science, open data. We shouldn't have to resequence information, resequence samples if they've already been done. That data should be available for others so that we can kind of, generally support value. And so that's also supported by the push towards, the FAIR principles, ensuring that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so in the development of the CARE principles, we specifically looked at what the FAIR principles were pushing towards, and we're like, okay, we support those, but the FAIR principles are very data-centric. You're talking about characteristics of the data itself, and you're not really talking about the people or the purpose for which the data has been generated. And that tended to be the focus of Indigenous data sovereignty principles. And that's where you have this sort of complementarity between the CARE principles and the FAIR principles. And so as the FAIR principles become operationalized, they push towards principles like this, or they push towards statements like sit here on the right-hand side. And so colleagues of mine that have been involved in Indigenous research with Indigenous communities, Indigenous researchers themselves, then put forward some alternative principles for what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about the use and sharing of Indigenous genomics data. And they're reflected in these kinds of principles where these issues around trust, accountability, and equity inform or available on request. There's lots of conversations, even in the push towards open data, about whether information is sitting in a place where people know that it's there, but they do have to. There's some sort of controls around access to it. Enhancing accountability, the provenance of Indigenous samples and genomic data be transparent, disclosed in publications, and maintained with the data. And so this whole, essentially this issue which arises where the guidelines which been involved in putting in place are really useful in the context of the research team that might be engaged in the collection of data itself, or the collection of samples and then the generation of data. But as soon as that data is then moved onto an open database, every other next user or the other next users won't necessarily have come into contact with those guidelines, and won't necessarily have and the information in those places doesn't necessarily share the nature of the conversations that happen between the research team that's generated the data and the community themselves, at least in terms of what sorts of protocols or agreements might have been in place. And then this, idea of how do you create greater equity, and some of that arises from the way that benefits are shared. So, credit should be given to communities to support future use, and benefit sharing agreements as appropriate. So, trying to broaden the sorts of things that researchers will think about when they're making the decisions. Because it's the people that have access to the data, the people that are using it, that are making decisions all the time about what they think a good outcome is and what are the things they need to be thinking about. And we were putting forward that these are things that need to be at front of mind when you're, working your way through a project. And they align with these issues which have been talked about. Digital sequence information, open data environments, how you go about sharing digital sequence information and collaborate around ethical access and use in ways that are consistent with community protocols. And also, how do you negotiate equitable outcomes from the use of digital sequence information, including potential commercialization? And one of the challenges in this space has really been when people were thinking about Nagoya, they were thinking about a direct engagement between the research group that wanted to go down a commercialization track and the community, and so that they would negotiate their mutually agreed terms, the benefit sharing arrangements at that point in time. But what we see now is that, because it's so much easier to sequence things, that there's all sorts of more general collection activities, and there's all sorts of activities that their primary purpose is a conservation one or a biodiversity one, not a biodiscovery one, but it generates data, and that data then, when it shifts into an open space, is available for all sorts of other uses, including biodiscovery and commercialization. But then that next user use is happening separate from a conversation with the community, and I think that's where part of the new challenges emerge. So one of the things that I've come across, which has been working on in the last couple of years, is the development of biocultural labels, and that's been done off the back of some great work done by Jane Anderson, who's based at New York University, around traditional knowledge labels. And so these are digital tags intended to be machine readable, that establish provenance for Indigenous data. And the intention is to create durable and persistent cultural metadata that can be included on these open databases alongside digital sequence information, or on databases alongside traditional knowledge. And they try to run a line between being consistent in terms of the icon remaining stable and recognizable across a variety of jurisdictions, but allowing some community control and definition through the customization of the metadata that's associated with them. And this is something we've been talking about with a range of communities around the world. The traditional knowledge labels themselves have been developed over the last 10 years and are being used by a number of communities. The biocultural labels are much earlier in the piece, but you'll see, you can go in and look at these. They sit on the localcontext.org website. Each of the labels has a why the label should be used and some template text. It's been translated into Spanish, French, and Maori. The attribution label is the label that's always used by communities, particularly in the context of their Indigenous or traditional knowledge that's sitting in sort of museums and archives. And you'll see here an example of how the metadata associated with the icon has been customized. So this one was done in the context of a virtual museum, and this is a community from British Columbia, and you'll see how they've also given their own name to the label, and just talk about what the connection of that material to them and what it means, and that they should be recognized if that material is used. And so there's 18 labels currently at the moment, traditional knowledge labels, covering things like attribution, but also cultural sensitive and things like seasonal. And I'll talk a little bit more a bit later about the different way or the different sorts of functions that the labels are providing. But one of the best examples, and the one that excited me and got me interested in thinking about how this might apply in the context of biodata, was this example with which has been worked through with the Passamaquoddy tribe in the Library of Congress, and really thinking about what does it mean to add cultural metadata and TK labels to records, and then what that provides. So this was being done in the context of some sound recordings, and it was 31 wax cylinders that with the first ever recordings of Native Americans on tribal lands, and this is what the record represented in the Library of Congress. We've got the name of the community, and that's pretty much it. And the community engaged with the Library of Congress in a discussion about the material and what other things could be provided, and putting the labels in place. And this is what the record looks like now. So the record itself has been enriched because you have all this additional information from the community about what it's about. And so this still sits as public information. And so this improved record is available to the public at large, which is, an additional value there. The community themselves are comfortable with sharing this additional information because their interests are being explicitly recognized with the use of the labels there. And you'll see the attribution label, an outreach label, which says that it's fine for this to be used for educational purposes, kind of permissions that says that's okay, but says that its use must be non-commercial. And also putting in place kind of a boundary around what that use looks like. So this represents like the public-facing record. So people can not only see the label, but what it means. But you've got this, this bit of record sitting here. Behind the scenes, there's things that need to take place to the infrastructures. So there were changes made to the MARC record, the changes made in the JSON file. So within the Library of Congress now, to allow the traditional knowledge labels to be in place for this, they had to create another field. And so that means that any item within the Library of Congress can now have labels attached to it. And that will start to emerge as other communities indicate what sorts of labels they would like to attach to their records. And they've also pushed us towards discussions around where the labels would sit in relation to the Dublin core. And so the labels here have been located within the rights field. And another example of that, and one of the things that was also which was also really interesting, was how they also got reflected within the rights advisory at the Library of Congress too. So the labels themselves, representing a cultural intellectual property right, get to sit here alongside the intellectual property right, which is held by the Peabody Museum. And they can sit, they can sit there alongside each other and make those things really clear to people that are looking to use that information. And so the conversation in seeing this and being directed towards Jane's work, got into a conversation with her about whether the same sort of model could be used in the context of genomic data and digital sequence information. And so that's where the BC labels emerged. And these are been developed, or this kind of initial set of 6 labels has been developed through a project here in New Zealand, working alongside universities, Crown Research Institutes, researchers that are working with genomic data, and then Jane herself, and also colleagues at Geome. And you'll see here that we've got a provenance label that relates in the same way to attribution, consent verified, given that consent is an important aspect to what future uses are enabled. Ability to say that things can continue to be used for research use, a little bit like the outreach one, but then sort of pushing towards if the data is still being in most cases, the data there's a separate conversation that will take place whether it stays open or not. My feeling is that when the labels are in place, people feel more comfortable about it sitting in an open environment. And within that open environment, you can be indicating to next users that actually as a community, you're open to collaboration or you're open to commercialization around how that information is used. And then the last one, which is similar to the TK labels, where you can acknowledge that there's multiple communities that might have interest in relation to the material you're talking about. And so we've done this in the same way. We've got the why I use this label. There's some template text that's been translated into these languages at the moment. And so that sits there as how the labels are intended to operate. As I mentioned before, the community control piece is really important. So the labels themselves can only be applied by communities, not by institutions or researchers. But we realize that actually that's an important component, that there are researchers that are often wanting to act in a responsible and ethical way that would like to support this process coming about. And so we've created notices, traditional knowledge and BC notices, which allow researchers to do a couple of things. One is to indicate that they know that there's these rights and interests which need to be articulated, but they can't do it, and they put the notice in place, and it acts as a placeholder until the labels can be added. But they make visible the institution commitments to the communities and the future use of that Indigenous data, supporting transparency and integrity in research. The other thing is that the use of the notices also help to make Indigenous data fair. So we're thinking about the ability to find Indigenous data amongst all of these systems. Often that's hard to do unless it's labelled in some kind of way, and the use of the notices helps with that. And so alongside these, there's also some cultural institution notices. They're just ones which allow institutions to say, hey, look, we're happy to engage in this kind of process. We're open to collaboration. People may be familiar with Geome, Genomic Observatory's metadata base. They have been working with us both in the build of our local context hub, but also thinking about integration of notices into their systems. This little label at the bottom there is the open to collaboration one, which is just as an institution they're doing that, but they're working out ways for people that are logging metadata associated with their projects in Geome to apply traditional knowledge notices or biocultural notices. And we see that there's an obvious value to Indigenous communities, but I think there's also a value to the research community as well, and them being able to demonstrate ethical practice and have that recognized not only within these sort of systems, but have it then translate across into publication spaces. And we've been involved in some discussions with Nature about, as the labels become operational, that they might also be reflected on the articles that are generated. Very much the same way as publishers are requesting that ORCID numbers get attached to articles as well. So we are in the middle of building the local context hub, which would be a space which would allow communities. So Whakatoya, this is my community. There's a mock-up, but we'll be involved in the beta testing phase within the next month or so, where we can go on the site, we can customize our labels, and be able to send things to institutions alongside. Along the hub would also allow institutional researchers to join, and they would be able to generate or develop or create projects and attach notices to them. And then those notices would, if the community is a part of the system, would be able to send automatic notifications to the community. It would register on our account, and we would be able to have a look at which labels we want to apply to that material and just send them back. And as a little bit of an example, we're involved in a project. So this is Whakatoya, this is my community, involved in a project working that's looking at marine heat waves. We've got interest in that because we're developing some offshore aquaculture farms. And so that material is really important, or that knowledge is really important. We have been bringing forward some of our traditional knowledge. So this occurs through a song which identifies a number of sites of significance along the coast, and you'll see those are reflected by the points here. And so there are references within the song, but then there's a whole series of information or traditional knowledge that sits around that, which we're really interested in thinking about that knowledge alongside sort of the science data that might emerge out of the project as well. So as we start to share our traditional knowledge into this research space, there's some bits which are fine to be used, and then there's other bits which we're requesting people that see it to respect our protocols. And so we've got an attribution label, a verified label, which says, this is, we're verifying this is real traditional knowledge, not fake traditional knowledge. And the third label there is community use only. So the actual singing of the song should only be done by community members, but the information held within it, which we're sharing in a sort of a different context, is fine to be used. Another strand of this project is actually sequencing or looking at genetic connectivity between some of the aquaculture species. And we're doing a mussel farm. We've got them sampling mussels across the same area, but a broader area. Now, our community is based primarily around numbers 11 and 12, those testing sites. All the other testing sites are now sitting in the spaces of other tribal areas. So as the gene sequence data is generated on the samples that are being collected, we're looking to apply the biocultural labels to that information. And so for us as our own community, but how we've been talking about it more generally in relation to the labels, is doing these three different things. One is helping to establish provenance, and that just means that the community can stay connected to the material as it moves into all the data, as it moves into the future. And so as values generated in the future, they get to be a part of conversations about how that benefit sharing might emerge. There's a series of labels that relate to protocols, and in this instance, these are mostly thinking about TK labels and traditional protocols around sharing and use. So some things would only be shared with men, some would only be shared with women, some might be only shared at particular times a year, and becomes a way of making visible to people that are accessing the information around what those protocols look like, and inviting them to to work with that information in the same sort of way. And then there's this third sort of component, which is talking about what sorts of things we can permission into the future in a generic way. So the outreach, educational use, commercial, non-commercial, those things can be clearly indicated. And I think, you're in a situation where if you wanted to do something that was outside of what things have been permissioned, you would then at least have the way to go back and engage in with the community in the conversation, saying, hey, are you interested in this? So this is where this kind of process is headed. We've been giving some thought to how the system would support the Nagoya protocol and expectations around access and benefit sharing, and how the BC labels would be able to reflect those different components of free, prior, informed consent, some indication of some mutually agreed terms, and lay a foundation for the conversations that would take place around benefit sharing. So it doesn't, I think that the system itself wouldn't deliver all of the elements of access and benefit sharing, but it lays a strong foundation for being able to have those conversations at the time those conversations are needed. So I guess, this whole lot of thinking has emerged out of these spaces that are thinking about Indigenous rights and interests and how Indigenous peoples get more control over what's happening with their data. So Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous data governance, they're largely about Indigenous control of Indigenous data. And that's not to be in control of the data itself, but to have an influence over the narratives that are generated, and to ensure that it's the use of that data then pushes towards delivering on Indigenous aspirations. So that's what I've got for our talk, and I'm happy to answer questions or engage in discussions. So kia ora.
Maui, that was awesome. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. If you have questions in the audience, please type them into the questions chat. And while we're waiting to see any of those, I have a couple for you. So the labels idea is really interesting and powerful. And I'm curious if you're even begun discussions with some of the major human genomic data providers, say the government organizations, DBGAP in the US or the EGA in Europe, for doing labeling for that kind of data.
Yeah, so not yet. With the Nagoya and the Nagoya protocol, digital sequence information is actually excluded, and one of the reasons has been around issues of practicality. And I think that that's something that this starts to address. Also, human genomic data has been excluded from that as well, but that doesn't make sense to any of the Indigenous communities we've been engaged with. And actually, there's been there's a few different communities that are engaged in research, sort of human research, human genomic research, that have expressed an interest in applying the labels, both in the US and in Canada. And so we're giving some thought to that. We haven't yet had direct conversations with some of those larger infrastructure providers. I mean, we've been engaged with people like the Sanger Institute, some of the sort of entities in New Zealand and Australia that are responsible for pulling together this kind of information. But I think we're still really at the stage of trying to work out how we deal with scale. So the traditional knowledge labels have been, very locally grounded and tend to deal with a smaller set of information. And as we've started to push into this sort of biocultural space, biodata space, we're then dealing with, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and stuff like that. So really this next stage is getting a sense of whether the kind of tech we're putting together can cope with that. And once we get a sense of how that will work, then we definitely want to engage with those larger kind of system providers.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I think this talk is important for this audience, and I hope we get a bigger audience on the video that stayed, because it seems to me there are some technical issues that computational biologists could possibly help out with, whether it's cryptographic protocols for making sure the labels stay attached, or things for making curation at scale possible, so that, if all of us dumps, 5,000 human genomes on some, tribal authority somewhere, that they're not overwhelmed by the, amount of work. And so I would hope that collaboration with computational biologists might, help advance these interests.
Yeah, look, so we're definitely interested in that. We know that that's going to be really important to make, to be able to get that sort of translation from the community engagement in setting what they want the labels to do, to then that being able to work in practice. And a lot of that's going to have to become machine readable. And, need to try and automate as much of that system as possible, because you don't want to create undue burden on either the research community or the Indigenous communities. So there's a series of those things which have to be thought through. There's issues around sort of, how would you track and trace them, so you can kind of maintain, so that sort of provenance is being maintained, and engage in the right sorts of conversations where we have a series of those sorts of conversations emerging, partly as we're also been talking about the development of standards. We've got a process with the IEEE around creating a recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous people's data. So, and that will be the first of probably some other things that need to happen as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a good engagement. I guess it leads me to, oh, good. We have another question, and I have one more for you too. But let's take this one. So the question, I don't know if you can see these, but I'll read it to you. It says, as a bioinformatician, what would you say is the most impactful thing I could do to help make sure I don't misuse data?
Yeah, see, this is it's actually an interesting one. I mean, it's actually an interesting one and a difficult one, because the use of data, which we've been thinking about this in the context of fear and care, and thinking that, in terms of fear, the data gets generated, it kind of sits in a place, and then you're trying to think about, okay, what are the things that sit around it that make it easier for people to access or find, or make it interoperable. And you can sort of define that within a particular space. I know you might need to be thinking about it as you're collecting it, but largely it's, kind of when it's sitting in that place where you're trying to curate it and make it useful for others, but you're not thinking so much about what they do with it into the future. Whereas when we're trying to think about the care principles, they have an application at the generation of the data, the curation of the data, but then the use of the data. And that requires sort of different tools in different places. And certainly Indigenous communities can't get involved in governance of data if they're not clear where it is. So if it's not fair, and you sort of in the context of it, it's not able to see that it's there, then all of these other conversations become very hit and miss. So that's why we do, and I'm not sure if this is just me, we've got this quite a focus around the use of the labels as a way of trying to ensure that comes about. Now, sometimes in some places, or with some sorts of data, that comes about because people have ethnicity data collection or kind of tribal affiliation data or something like that. Anything that can kind of sit in place that allows them to find it and then be involved in in whatever that next conversation about what appropriate access looks like.
Yeah, well, that's, makes it complicated, right, for researchers who are trying to do the right thing to, have to pay attention to provenance and, missing data. And I think once people know, then the idea of how to engage with tribal IRBs or whatever the equivalent kind of indigenous decision-making bodies are is easier. It's just hard to know in the first place that it's needed and where to go, which is why I think the labels are such an interesting idea. I do want to get my other question in, though, which is maybe a little further afield for you, but I'm curious anyway, which is really about capacity building. So you draw distinctions a couple of times in your talk between researchers and indigenous communities, or data scientists and indigenous communities. And I think do you have any insight, perhaps for your own community, about how we might build capacity and generate interest within indigenous communities for gaining these skills and doing this work?
Yeah, I think it's, it ends up being a pretty sort of broad, multifaceted thing. You don't just, I don't know, maybe you guys woke up one morning and just thought, I'm going to be a bioinformatician, but kind of figure it's, you probably, I don't know, maybe you start playing games and then you get into something else, but, so sort of that pathway into data science in the first place, and then how that then kind of gets you into the space, I think is important. That's why I think one of the interesting things around the labels is it means people can engage in the sorts of issues about it without having to feel like you're the expert in the coding part, but it sort of starts to edge you closer and closer into those. So that's where Sing has been really interesting, because we're really trying to expose people from the community to that context and that environment and the things that are going on, and have them, working with people that came out of different disciplines. So they could be, you might not be the expert around the bioinformatics, but you might have been an expert around some of the cultural issues. And then in the other spot, then you're not, but someone else isn't. And so they get to support each other through that. We we're planning to develop a version of Sing, but more for data science or indigenous data, and trying to see if we can use that as another avenue for building that sort of expertise. There's a series of different sorts of coding academies and initiatives just supporting STEM generally, and kind of computer literacy and data literacy generally, that are starting to emerge. So I think all of those things are going to start to layer up, but I think creating opportunity is important. And how we do that, either by supporting existing initiatives or creating opportunities through projects ourselves for people to get that development, I think is important.
That's awesome. I will follow up with you on that offline, but I want to get we have one more question here that we have a couple more minutes, and I think is a pretty interesting question, which is, do you have thoughts on ancient individuals, especially those more than 15 or 20,000 years old, where there is not a clear community to connect with, but these ancient individuals have contributed to modern day indigenous ancestry?
Yeah, so we have actually been engaging with some of the communities and some of the researchers in the US that are involved with work with ancient individuals. And they're interested in the idea of how labels might apply in that kind of context, and what does it mean? What does it mean to not necessarily be what would you call it? To be responsible. So the labels, people are expressing an interest in being responsible for that information and how it's being used and what it's being used for. And so I think there are, at least the examples I'm familiar with in the US, you've often had a number of communities that have been expressing a connection to those remains and wanting to be involved in the process of how they get used. And I think, I guess from my point of view, they have as legitimate a right to be involved in the conversation as an institution or an agency or someone else, because essentially they haven't got any stronger connection with those individuals or than that community does, but they're just asserting a responsibility or a right to be able to do something with it. And I think this whole idea, which is in some ways also what we're going to have to work through, is what does it mean when you have a whole series of groups that have a shared interest in something in terms of being able to take it forward. And I think this is kind of we just have to sort of be rethinking our ways of how we deal with that isn't necessarily a property in the same sort of way, or as it shifts from this sort of shared interest space into one where we do want to create a property that people have been included in that process.
Yeah, complicated questions. The question came from Elena Zavala, who is a graduate student at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, which is in Leipzig, Germany. So it's not just an American issue.
Well, so just been having conversations with a colleague. Actually, she was down here in New Zealand. She's in the US now, but she's involved with the European Genome Genome Reference Atlas.
Yep.
Yeah, and so she's involved with the ELSI part there, and it's really wanting to see how labels might work in the context of dealing with Sami communities up in Europe as well.